program that I will guarantee you, after the presentation, when you leave here, you're going to be less comfortable than when you walked in. So, I'm sorry to say that, but full disclosure. I want to acknowledge our sponsors for the Professional Lunch Series, our friends at Michigan United Credit Union. They're great longtime sponsors of the Chamber. They're one of our legacy level sponsors. And we couldn't do programs like this without our corporate sponsor support. So thank you so much to Michigan United Credit Union. We also want to thank the Community House for being such a wonderful host venue. I believe you've hosted the entire series, Tim, so we're very thankful for that. And I want to introduce the Community House Chief Financial Officer, Tim Hunt, who's just going to say a couple words. So,
yeah, thank you very much for all attending here today. I just want to thank the Chamber and pass it back to you and for hosting this entire series. It's been very educational for our staff as well to sit in and learn and grow, as employers in the area, and just to have all of you in the building. It's been great. So thank you very much for your time.
Thank you, Tim.
Yeah.
And before we start the program, I just want to give a couple of brief updates as to what we have planned for all of you between now and the end of the year. First up, on October 31st is our member coffee, our monthly member coffee, and this one's kind of special because it culminates the celebration of Chamber of Commerce Month, which is October, and we'll actually be hosting it at our offices in Adams Square at 725 South Adams. So if you've not been to our office, please come by, stop by, and meet the rest of the team, see where we do our magic. And for those of you who have been to the office but not there for a while, after 14 years, we've done a long overdue refresh of the office. We spiffed it up with new paint, new carpet, new furniture, so stop by and see some of the improvements that we made so we can serve you all even more effectively. In November, at a date still to be determined because we're working with some political calendars, we are going to be doing our legislative reception. So that's where we do an evening. It's an evening event where we invite all of our elected officials to come and meet one-on-one with our members to talk about things that keep you up at night regarding state laws, regulations, restrictions, changes, which you're about to hear. And so as soon as we get that date nailed down, we will let you know. It's a great event because there's no speeches, there's no formal programming. You just come, have a beverage, have some food, and you can walk right up to your member of Congress and tell them what's on your mind as long as it's appropriate. Just have to say that. And then in December, we have our annual meeting, which is right back here at the Community House downstairs in the main ballroom. That's on December 5th. And then on December 9th, we wrap up the year with our annual holiday mixer at Fogo de Chão in Troy. So please mark those dates on your calendar. All the information's on our website. As you all know, you can register directly from our website, and hopefully we'll see you there. So before I turn this over to Linda Hatfield from the Credit Union, who's going to introduce our guest speaker, I want to thank Hannah and I want to thank Clark Hill for coming in today and doing this for us, providing this really valuable information. We kind of did this on short notice after I attended a session a couple weeks ago and went, oh boy, we need to get this information out. So I reached out to Clark Hill, which is another long-standing supporter of the Chamber and a legacy member, and they were kind enough to put this together for us. So, and just so you know, if you've got colleagues after this morning that you think would benefit from this information, we are live streaming it, and then it will also be available on our YouTube channel that people can just do that, and we'll send the link out to everybody that you can share with your colleagues. So with that, I'd like to call up to the podium Linda Hatfield, who's going to introduce our speaker.
Good morning, and thank you, Joe. I, along with Jim Baylor, our Vice President of Marketing, and Stephanie Tom, our Head of HR, would like to thank you again for coming this morning to attend this event. As Joe stated, Michigan United Credit Union is a proud legacy sponsor of the Birmingham Bloomfield Chamber of Commerce for several years. And as part of our sponsorship, this, I have to tell you, is probably one of my favorite programs. Over the years, the selection of speakers has been inspirational, motivating, of high caliber, and as I said, very well attended. And I can guarantee you today is going to be absolutely no exception to that. So I'm proud right now to be able to be introducing our speaker. Hannah K. Reisdorf defends clients in matters arising under federal statutes such as Title VII, the ADA, the ADEA, and the FMLA, as well as parallel state law statutes, whistleblower claims, breaches of contract, and wrongful termination claims. Hannah has experience representing clients before the EEOC, the Michigan Department of Civil Rights, from start to resolution. She helps guide businesses through audits, investigations initiated by federal and state regulatory agencies, including the Department of Labor. Prior to joining Clark Hill, Hannah worked across the country representing businesses in a variety of commercial litigation matters. She also worked with the Suffolk County District Attorney and its Family Protection Unit. So without further ado, Hannah.
Thank you, Linda. Thank you, Joe. I think you will find that Joe is absolutely correct. As much information as I try and give you today, there's a lot to take in right now, and there are a lot of big changes. So hopefully I can answer as many questions as possible. But my heart is with you all who are the ones who are going to be boots on the ground implementing some of these changes. So we have quite a bit of information. I'm going to try and clip along, and so we can save plenty of room for questions, because I have a feeling at least some of you will have some. So with that, let's get started. So we're going to start with talking about state and federal wage changes. These will include things like changes to the FLSA salary basis and the Michigan minimum wage changes. And then we're going to get into Michigan's new Earned Sick Time Act. I think that's where the most monumental changes are coming into effect, and that's the area that's going to require the most preparation on your end. So we will get into some steps that you all can take to get that into effect. So by way of background, who has heard about the salary basis changes for overtime exemption? Okay, good, most people. So just by way of background, last year we've been expecting this for some time under the Biden administration, but the DOL teed up the fact that there was going to be finally this change in the salary basis requirements for exemption. So that means that the amount that someone needs to earn that is a guaranteed weekly minimum is going to increase in order to be exempt from overtime. So in April of this year, the DOL announced that there were going to be 2 rounds of changes. The first increase was going to go into effect on July 1st, so that change is in effect as we speak. And then the next round of changes, which is even more, is going to go into effect January 1 of 2025. So before these went into effect, there was some litigation in Texas, in the federal courts in Texas, that was trying to halt the implementation or enforcement of these changes. This is unsurprising. Texas and the Fifth Circuit, they have a long history of doing this. They've challenged multiple salary increases throughout the years, including one in 2019. The July increase went into effect for most employers other than state of Texas employees, which is not going to affect hopefully many of you. But then in September, we got a surprise ruling from the Fifth Circuit. The Fifth Circuit finally ruled on that 2019 challenge to whether or not the DOL had the authority to set these salary minimums in order to qualify for overtime. And the Fifth Circuit essentially said, yes, the department has that authority, but within limits. So what does this mean for January? Favorite lawyer answer, we don't know yet. That said, I think that there is a good chance that these are going to go into effect now that the Fifth Circuit has said essentially, yes, they have the authority to do this. I don't think, as steep as the new increases are, I don't think that they are unconscionable or outside the bounds of the agency's authority. That said, the Fifth Circuit is incredibly conservative. It is looking for a reason to strike these down, and so it is entirely possible the January change will not go into effect. That said, we're going to talk about it, so you're ready in case it does. So who are we talking about? We're talking about your exempt employees. So your non-exempt folks are those who get paid on an hourly basis, sometimes a salary basis, but essentially they're entitled to overtime based on how they're paid and the work that they perform. The exempt employees are those that satisfy the job duties requirements and hit that salary threshold that we've been talking about. So that includes the folks who you might have heard referred to as EAP employees. There's executive, administrative, and professional folks. And then a subsect of these, which are considered highly compensated employees. They don't have as rigid of job duties requirements, but they are paid a healthy six-figure salary. So under the old rules, in order to be exempt from overtime, at least from a salary standpoint, an employee had to earn a guaranteed $684 a week. You can see that amounted to a little over $35,000 a year. July 1, that went up to a guaranteed $844 a week. And you can see in January 1, that's going to go up even higher to a guaranteed $1,128 a year, so almost $60,000 a year. That's quite a change. It's just shy of double. That said, the job duties requirements are not going to change. Under the old highly compensated rule, folks needed to earn a little over $107,000 a year. That's up to, you can see, almost $144,000. And then that's going to have another bit of a hike up to $151,000. And then another thing that is included in these rules is that there's going to be an automatic review of the salary thresholds every 3 years. It's, I think, the department's intent to kind of avoid this situation where you suddenly get these really big hikes that appear a little out of nowhere. So just as a refresher, again, we're talking about those EAP employees, those executive, administrative, and professional employees. The executive folks, those are pretty self-explanatory. Those are going to be the ones managing the enterprise or department thereof. So those are your management employees, right? They supervise 2 or more employees, and they have the ability to hire and fire. Or even if they don't have the sole responsibility of hiring, firing, their input into whether that decision should be made is given considerable weight. So we're not talking about, say, a shift supervisor who sits in on an interview to make sure that someone's going to be a good fit for their team, but at the end of the day, upper level management is going to be the one making the call. We're envisioning more scenarios where ultimately human resources might be the one to formally approve a termination or a hiring decision, but it was really the manager who ultimately had the ability to say to HR, hey, I really think that it's time for this person to go, or hey, I think this person would be a great addition to the team, and HR basically says, great, good to go. Administrative employees, those are a little trickier. I think that this is the hardest exemption category to navigate, because as you can see, it's a little wishy-washy. So for these administrative folks, their primary duty includes office or non-manual work that goes to the general business operations of the company. So if you are, say, in manufacturing, it's going to be your customer service staff, your accountants, things like that. So think back of the house. And these are folks who exercise discretion or independent judgment over matters of significance. A good rule of thumb is that these are folks who have the ability to make decisions that are going to have a financial impact or really strongly shape policy and procedure. And then finally, professionals, Those are folks who have to have typically a higher level or higher education degree. Their work requires the use of very specialized knowledge. A common thing I see happen with this exemption category is requiring a general college degree, or requiring, say they are a lab technician, and they can have a degree in biology, chemistry, biochemistry. That's probably not going to be specific enough. It would have to, because in theory, that's quite a broad category of knowledge, right? That's basically most science. So that's not going to be specialized enough to qualify for this exemption. Think CPAs, doctors, lawyers, teachers, folks like that. Yes, Joe.
I had a quick question. When you were talking about the salary threshold, you said a guaranteed weekly salary. So does that mean that discretionary commission cannot be included in that salary figure?
So yes and no. But the weekly guarantee, right, that has to basically stay as is. That said, it's up to 10% of kind of non-discretionary bonuses can get built into that. But if you give a year-end bonus that's based on performance, that's not realistically probably going to be able to count towards that. It's also going to be incredibly difficult to implement because you're going to have to deal with it on the back end. So the DOL's real goal in setting these thresholds is to create stability at a certain level. That said, there are other kinds of exemptions depending on what they do that are based more on things like, you know, commissions or large bonuses, and we can have a conversation about those if you think that, you know, you've got someone who might fall into that category. So those are the federal changes, at least the major federal changes. State changes, we know that in Michigan the minimum wage is going to go up and that the tip credit is going to increase. So if you work in hospitality or the restaurant industry and you have tipped employees, this is going to be a really, really significant change for you. If you don't and you enjoy eating out at restaurants, this is also going to be a big change for you because you're going to feel it in your bills. Who here has seen dollar amounts in this first column that are more along the lines of $12 and $14? Okay. I'm going to address that. So, like a lot of issues in this presentation, things are subject to change. These are areas that are moving very quickly. They're being directed by implementation of a ballot initiative, and they can be subject to some legislative fixes or interpretation. So, when the Supreme Court's decision came out, basically setting these new minimum wage requirements, they indicated that these would be the numbers and percentages. Dana Nessel, the Attorney General, said, hold on, we see about 5 different ways to interpret this decision. We're not sure if these numbers are correct. We don't know how you're gonna deal with this. So last month, a couple weeks ago, the Michigan Supreme Court issued some guidance, a clarifying opinion, if you will, about what the numbers would be. These are those numbers and percentages. So this is the most recent information we have in terms of what the minimum wages are going to be and the tip credit percentages. That said, the slight caveat is that these are going to be subject to additional adjustment by the treasurer for inflation. So these are good benchmarks when it comes to forecasting and business planning, but just know that down the road, these could increase by a little bit depending on inflation. So as you can see here, February 21st, that's going to be your magic date for minimum wage changes and the ESTA changes. We're going to have a $10 minimum wage. The minimum tip wage percentage is going to be 48%. And you can see here, year by year, it's going to increase. They gave us projections up to 2028, and then from then on, it's going to be largely in the hands of the Treasury to continue to make those adjustments. Okay, Michigan earned sick time. I think this is probably the one that's on everyone's mind and the one that's going to affect everyone in this room. So how did we get here? Essentially in 2028, there were groups circulating ballot initiatives that were going to increase earned sick time and also those minimum wage changes that we just saw on the previous slide. They got enough signatures to get the initiatives on the ballot. But under the Michigan Constitution, before an initiative can go to the voters, the sponsor has to submit it to the legislature, who has three options. They can enact it without change, basically saying, you know what, you're right, this sounds like a great idea, it looks really popular, let's just get it on the books. They can reject it, and then it goes onto your ballot, it's in the hands of the voter. Or they can reject it and propose something new entirely. The legislature basically took a totally different approach and they did something new. So they adopted the proposals as submitted, which in theory should just put them into effect. But then during lame duck, they amended them, which Governor Snyder did sign. So that's where we got the Paid Medical Leave Act. It's where we got the old 40 hours, higher employee head count in order to qualify, things like that. So that went through a lot of litigation, and it hung out at the Supreme Court for a while, and so then finally, back in July, we finally got a ruling on this. The Michigan Supreme Court said that what the legislature did was unconstitutional, and it put the ballot initiative in place as written, with it going into effect in 205 days, which was, if I recall correctly, basically it was either in the measure itself or that was the original timeline for when it would have gone into effect. So what does this mean and what do we have to do about it? So the Earned Sick Time Act is going into effect February 1st of 2025. That's when it goes onto the books. It's technically enforceable. One thing we don't know is whether the Michigan regulatory bodies that enforce these rules are going to start enforcing them on February 21st. I would not be surprised if there is some kind of grace period. That said, there is, and we'll get into it in a little bit, a private cause of action for employees who feel that they have not been able to properly exercise their rights under ESTA, and so that won't necessarily affect any kind of enforcement mechanism or anything like that. They're going to be on their own track, free to do as they wish. Under the Earned Sick Time Act, employers are going to have to give more paid sick time to more employees for more reasons. And that time is going to accrue sooner. There's going to be an unlimited carryover, and there's going to basically be a broader, in theory, time to use those benefits throughout the year. So who is considered an eligible employee? Who do you have to provide this new paid sick time to? Well, under the language of the statute itself, it includes any individual engaged in service to an employer in the business of the employer. That, I see you laughing, it's basically everybody, right? So one of the questions that I've gotten a lot is, what do we do about independent contractors? So luckily, Leo provided this extra additional clarification on how they interpret it, Leo being Michigan Department of Labor and Economic Opportunity. They added, from whom an employer is required to withhold for federal income tax purposes. So it's a carve out to basically pull out those independent contractors and keep it to true employees. That said, make sure, as a PSA, make sure all your employees are properly classified. This is probably not the time to try and reclassify folks just for the sake of skirting around this. It does not include individuals who are employed by the federal U.S. government, and it does only apply to employees who are located in the state of Michigan. So if you have folks who are working remotely in Ohio, or you have an office in Arizona, those folks are not going to be entitled to all of that new paid sick time. That said, when we start to think about who is covered and which employers are covered and how to count head count, it gets a little murkier in terms of those state line issues. So under the old PMLA, employers with 50 or more employees were the ones who had to provide Paid Medical Leave Act benefits. It was specifically designed to exclude independent contractors. Obviously, that's gotten cleared up a little bit by Leo, but it's still not something that's necessarily in the statute itself. So that's just one little caveat to be aware of. I do think that it's safe to assume that independent contractors don't fall into this bucket. But again, this is not something that's been litigated and gone up through the courts yet. So just a little caveat there. Under ESTA, every employer with one or more employees has to provide this new paid sick time. That said, there is an exception or a little bit of a difference in what you have to allow for employers with fewer than 10 or 9 or fewer employees. And just an aside, does anyone here have union employees? They're governed by a CBA? Oh, okay. Just for everyone's education, if you do have a CBA in place, that CBA is going to continue to control until it expires, and then these ESTA requirements are going to kick in. So, how do you know if you qualify as a small employer or a larger employer? How do we count this 10 employee threshold? So an employer is going to meet the threshold if it employs 10 or more employees in 20 or more work weeks in the current or previous calendar year. This does not need to be consecutive. So if you can run a really lean staff, but you've got a busy season for a couple of months, roughly 5, and you've got 10 or more folks on board, you're going to have to provide the sick benefits that would apply to any other large employer, even if you have those ebbs and flows in your head count. It's going to include full-time employees, part-time employees, and here's the one that I think is really the kicker: temporary employees. So employees that are provided to you through a staffing company or a temp agency, an organization like that, they are going to go to your head count. So if you have to bring those types of contractors on board in a limited period, it's going to affect your head count. That said, make sure when you're looking at your staffing agreements, you're looking at your temp agency agreements, make sure that you are very clear that the burden to provide these benefits is going to fall on the staffing company. Is that going to be foolproof in the event that they don't get those benefits? It remains to be seen. I think that there's a good chance that courts would find that there's a joint liability issue there, that you as the company who's utilizing these folks needed to make sure that they were getting the benefits they were entitled to. But just as you move forward and you start negotiating those new agreements, make sure that you really clarify that those staffing companies are going to be the ones responsible for providing those benefits. The law is silent on how you count the number of employees based on location. So by that I mean, we don't know if it means 10 or more employees in the state of Michigan, those folks that you do have to provide the benefits to, or if you have to look at your company as a whole. Say you have 20 employees, they're across the country, and 2 sit in your Farmington Hills office. Do you have to provide all 72 hours to these 2 Michigan employees based on your national head count? We don't know. As a matter of caution, I would recommend, at least at this stage, counting nationally given the broadness of the statute itself, and because you don't necessarily want to get hit with a violation. They're going to remain covered for the remainder of the year, and because we had that look back, it's also going to apply to the following calendar year, or until the employer no longer meets that 20 or more work requirement. That said, again, because it looks backwards into the previous calendar year, again, it's going to be roughly a year long. Yes?
Question, you mentioned earlier, if you have an employee that it works remotely out of state, so we have one employee
Mm-hmm.
in Florida, just one. So how I understand what you said is they wouldn't be included in this law, but is there any issue with us just including them anyway?
Are you saying that you have like multiple employees in Michigan, but just one who works in Florida?
Correct.
Okay, so the way the statute is written, it said in terms of who is entitled to these sick time benefits, it says each employee in this state. That said, you can of course provide additional benefits to this employee in Florida, especially if you could see it becoming, more of an employee relations issue. They know that every single person is getting 72 hours of paid leave except for them. There's no harm in that. Does that answer your question?
It does.
Okay.
Okay, but it does clearly state just in Michigan.
Yes.
Okay.
Yes.
Perfect.
So how can you use this paid sick time? It is broader than it was under the PMLA, under the Paid Medical Leave Act. The reasons that you would expect would be covered: injury, illness, seeking preventative care, public health emergencies that affect the business itself, or in instances of domestic violence and sexual assault. Under the Earned Sick Time Act, it's going to be for those same reasons, but it also adds some more protections for families with children. So it also includes meetings at a child's school or daycare or other care facility that are related to those same kind of reasons: health, disability, sexual assault, things like that. Who is considered a family member, right? If you're able to care for family members, take time to care for family members under these rules. It includes the obvious for the PMLA: kids, parents, spouse, grandparents, grandkids, and siblings. ESTA expands it to include all those folks plus domestic partners. And here's some of my favorite language from the statute: any individual related by blood or affinity whose close association with the employee is the equivalent of a family relationship. I think that this is going to be an area where we see employees maybe get a little daring in how they want to take their time off. What does it mean to have a close affinity with someone, or a blood blood relationship with someone? Right? I grew up with very close family friends. They were Aunt Debbie and Aunt Kay, and that was how I knew them. Would I be able to drive them to a doctor's appointment under this new statute? I don't know. How do you litigate how closely you are with someone? So that's an area to watch out for, and just know that it's coming. I would bet quite a lot of money we will see at least one employee try and take time to take care of a pet. That's where I think we're going to see it. How can you use this? So under the PMLA, you could use it in technically hour increments, unless you had a different policy in your handbook or in any other kind of benefit document. So we saw a lot of 4-hour, half-day and full-day use requirements under the PMLA. Under ESTA, it's going to get trickier. So you can use the smaller of 1 hour, or the smallest increment that you use to count absences or use of other time. So I know that there are a lot of employers who will count an absence after, say, 15 minutes of tardiness, a half hour of tardiness, things like that. That's when you start to consider someone absent. That means you're going to have to allow ESTA usage in that 15-minute or that 30-minute increment. I think it's going to be very hard to effectuate. I have the statute, right? Oh my gosh, I'm so sorry, I was late. You know, Sally was throwing up this morning, Bobby had a fever, you know, we're all good now. Under the PMLA, you could require them to use sick time for that coverage. It's not prohibited by the statute. I see no reason why you could not continue to make that usage compulsory. That said, it is a place where the statute is silent. Does that answer your question?
It does.
Okay.
Seems like it could be a benefit to the employer to say, if that's your excuse, that's fine, but if you have these hours, we have to use them.
Absolutely. How much is someone going to get paid these benefits? So under the PMLA, it did not specify, although I think as a rule of thumb, most people were just using basically whatever their hourly rate was, whatever kind of time you would otherwise use for vacation. So maybe you have a facility that pays folks hourly, but there's a shift differential. Vacation time gets paid without the shift differential. The PMLA time would be paid without the shift differential. If it's someone who is salaried, you just continue to pay them their entire salary, you know, things like that. Under ESTA, the clarifying guidance from Leo has been changed from the normal hourly wage to the regular rate of pay, which is incredibly enlightening. It clarifies everything, doesn't it? So we have a few extra details. If the hours vary, it has to be paid at the employee's average hourly rate, the pay period immediately before the time is used. So that can get very tricky if you have part-time employees or folks who are on call or things like that. And then the regular rate for tipped employees is going to be the applicable minimum wage rate. But it remains a little unclear whether or not hourly rates are going to include things like non-discretionary bonuses. If, say, the week before was when maybe a perfect attendance bonus came out for everybody. It's a little unclear in terms of whether or not that's going to have to get rolled into that hourly rate when it comes to ESTA time. So the accrual rate and the carryover, I think that this is probably one of the biggest areas of change that's going to be the hardest to implement. So under the PMLA, employees earn 1 hour of sick time for every 35 hours worked. You get a maximum of 40 hours per benefit year, and you did not have to permit more than 40 hours of carryover. Now it's 1 hour work for every 30 hours of work. There is no express cap. The good news is that there's no requirement that you have to pay it out on termination, but we can talk about how that's going to affect why you might want a couple different buckets of leave now. And all unused time has to carry over year on year. Okay. Oh,
So just a quick, so going back to that carryover.
Mhm.
So now there's no longer carryover. It's no longer capped at 72 hours.
so you have unlimited carryover of the PMLA time. Let's say someone earns all 72 hours and they never take a minute off. That will roll into the next benefit year. They will continue to accrue every 30 hours more time. Say they get halfway through the year, they're looking at, I don't know, 100 hours of accrued ESTA time. Sorry, I just lost my train of thought. They have 100 hours of accrued ESTA time. They find themselves very ill, a family member is very ill, they're gonna have to take a significant amount of time off to care for this person. They can only use 72 hours of that leave. So it doesn't mean that, all of a sudden you're gonna find yourself with an employee who in 2 or 3 years could basically take months off at a time and still be covered. I'm gonna pause really quickly and plug my laptop in, and not realize that this was not charging, so 1 second. So can I scooch this, do you know? Okay, sorry about that.
Hannah?
Yes.
So, one of the other things I think that is a bit of a change is, if I remember correctly, under ESTA, isn't there like, an employee can take like up to 3 days and not have to document the purpose of their leave? Whereas-
Yes.
And the company is no longer required, the company is no longer allowed to require the employee to document the purpose for their leave, is that correct?
For absences of 3 days or more, that is correct. And we'll get into a little bit more about the documentation requirements and prohibitions in a minute, but your question is certainly well taken. I think that's definitely going to be another area where it's going to be challenging to enforce good faith usage of this time off. Okay, so usage caps and accruals, we touched on this already, but under the PMLA, you could set a 40-hour limit, and you could also pretty easily front load those 40 hours. The PMLA also basically allowed essentially kind of like a buyback. So if you front loaded 40 hours and say the employee ultimately did not earn all 40 hours, you could kind of handle that, the back end in termination. That is not provided for in the statute under ESTA. But the one thing that it does mention is that there are going to be different usage requirements for small employers and large employers. So that 10 or more cap that we talked about earlier. So for folks that have 10 or more employees, your folks are going to be entitled to 72 hours of paid leave for the year, or up to 72 hours of paid leave for the year. However, if you are a small business, you can write 40 hours of paid leave. That's going to come first, and then up to 32 hours of unpaid leave. So there's a little bit of reprieve there. I know it's not much, but every little bit is going to help in this case. So continuing that thread of what are we going to do about usage, and I think we touched a little bit on whether or not we wanted to keep combined leave policies where you just had a general PTO pot, right? Where it was sick time, it was vacation time, it was all of it. So under the PMLA, if the employer provided at least 40 hours of paid leave, especially if that was up front, the employer was presumed to be in compliance. So that was a good safe harbor. I know a lot of us put those kinds of policies in place just to make sure everything was covered, and it ran relatively smoothly. So under ESTA, you can technically still have a combined pot of leave. The question is whether or not you're going to want to do that, and we can talk about that a little bit more towards the end when we start thinking about how we want to draft policies going forward. But under ESTA, that presumption still exists in a sense, in that if you do provide 72 hours that that an employee can use for the same reasons that are covered by ESTA, even if you add other things on there, like vacation time, personal time, things like that, you're going to be okay. That said, you have to continue to allow the employee to accrue the time. And as we mentioned before, there is that issue about how do you true it up on the back end that doesn't appear to be there. So I think employers are gonna have to really weigh if you wanna front load 72 hours, continue to have the employee accrue, knowing full well they're never gonna be able to use more than 72 hours. But what do you do with someone who, say, is part-time? Do you really wanna give them the full 72 hours, not knowing if they'll ever earn it, or not knowing if there's ever gonna be a way to true it up? Or maybe you have a really high turnover workforce. Do you want to provide 72 hours of protected leave straight out of the gate, have someone show up for 2 weeks, take 72 hours of leave, and then bounce? It's going to be a tough call. Yes?
So I have a question with the kind of that 3-day rule you were talking about too.
Mm-hmm.
Are you still empowered to have pre-authorization requirements within your hiring policy? So like if you take up to the 3 days, anything after that, then it has to have some pre-authorized approval. And or how does this then affect like short-term disability requirements after 5 days or FMLA requirements?
Mhm.
So how much are you empowered in your hiring documentation to say what your requirements are to follow this?
So, great question. Employees have to give notice basically as soon as practicable. And that has to be up to about 7 days advance notice, right? If you know that you're going to have a meeting with the school counselor and it's scheduled in advance, yes, you can ask for notice for that time period. If someone is, you know, in an accident or something comes up and they're gone, you know, for, let's say, 3 days on the nose, you know, realistically, I don't know if you were gonna get notice in that situation under an old rule either, but it is going to be increasingly difficult to get that notice,
Yeah.
especially because of these documentation requirements. So Joe is right, as we touched on earlier, you cannot ask for documentation for absences of 3 days or less.
Yeah, I'm not gonna extend it. So
Yeah.
if someone wanted to claim 40 to 72 hours,
Mm-hmm.
what can you still get creative in your hiring guidelines
Mm-hmm.
and requirements on what is required for pre-authorization to take that extended amount of time before you start falling into other categories of
Mhm.
off or leave, extended leave?
So you can still ask for the same types of paperwork and requirements for things like FMLA leave, right? Nothing in ESTA abrogates those requirements to get certification for FMLA leave, submit your, you know, paperwork and go to the clinic or what have you to get your short-term disability benefits. If you need an accommodation for any sort of disability or impairment, you can still require documentation for those situations. You know, given that you are talking about longer leave, you can ask for documentation in those situations when it's, you know, obviously done in advance or on the back end. Just know that, as the second bullet indicates, the employer is going to be responsible for covering any out-of-pocket expenses that the employee incurs as a result of having to get any kind of ESTA paperwork. So if they go to the doctor and the doctor says, I would recommend you be off of work for 3 days, right? Technically, they don't have to provide any kind of paperwork. You know, that is what it is. The doctor says you have to be off for 4 days, and they return, you can ask for documentation in that case. That said, if now they have to go back to their doctor and maybe incur a copying fee or a note fee, or there's something that their insurance won't cover, you're going to have to be the one to foot that bill, which is going back to your question about what do we do about employee handbooks or hiring paperwork, things like that. I see no reason why you can't put some kind of advisory note that, you know, if you anticipate that you will be out of work for more than 3 days, something to this effect, we encourage you to obtain a doctor's note. That doesn't mean you have to ask for it, but it might, and it doesn't mean that they're going to do it, but it might at least help cut on that area of cost a little bit. If they're already there, they're already getting treated, there's no extra fee for a return visit to get that note. It's a small cost, but it's a cost nonetheless. Another note on paperwork, it can't include if it's an instance of domestic violence or sexual assault that is the reason for the absence. You can't ask for details or things like that, but things like a police report or a statement from a victim advocate will suffice. The same applies for illness. Keep detail to a minimum. Don't ask someone to explain their illness or something like that. If the doctor or the care provider says they needed to be out for the week, then that's it. They needed to be out for the week. Again, notice, which we've talked about. Previously there was no notice requirement. You could put a lot more structure, I think, in place in terms of what you were asking people to tell you in advance. That said, you still had to comply with usual and customary notice, right? If someone is in a car accident and they don't tell you until the next day, please don't terminate them for not calling in, right? That's just a bad practice. But again, under ESTA, if it's foreseeable, you can require advance notice, but not more than 7 days. And again, same kind of rule of thumb. If it's unforeseeable, you can still require notice as soon as practicable. Reinstatement of accrued time and record keeping. These are two more little details that are in the rule. But again, if you have maybe a seasonal workforce or a high turnover workforce, under the PMLA, there was no requirement to reinstate hours. So, if someone was gone for a bit of time and they started over and they had accrued all this time previously, you didn't have to give them that time back. Under ESTA, if someone returns to work, let's say someone leaves work in January, the holidays are over, their time rolled over, they had 50 hours of ESTA time that had been unused, they left for whatever reason, maybe we're in a slow period, maybe they wanted to try something new, what have you, they come back in 4 months, that time that they had accrued, that I think I said 50 hours, they would start back with that 50 hours if they came back in less than 6 months. Record keeping, so this is, I think, going to be another area where it gets a little tricky in terms of what's verbatim in the statute versus what is realistic in terms of how we keep track of hours. So under the PMLA, you had to keep records of leave accrued and time worked for up to a year. Under ESTA, you have to maintain those records for 3 years, which is actually really consistent with most Michigan record keeping requirements anyway. So things like payroll and things like that. I would recommend holding on to those 3 years for 3 years. Even if this wasn't in the statute, just for audit purposes, possible litigation purposes, things like that. But again, you have to have records documenting the hours worked and the leave taken. They make this very clear. What do you do about your exempt employees and your salaried folks who aren't punching a clock? It's not clear whether or not you need to start having those folks keep track of their hours. Now, that said, there's other language in the statute that says that salaried employees, exempt employees, they are presumed to work, if they are full-time, to work 40 hours in a week. So knowing that presumption is built in, I think especially if you have in your pay-keeping system, your payroll system or your time-keeping system, you have automatic 40 hours show up somewhere on their pay stub for salaried folks. Not everyone does, but some do. I think that is probably going to be sufficient. Obviously, the closer you can keep to true hours worked for any employee, I think is always going to benefit you in the long run. That said, this is an area where I think there's gonna be a little frustration in terms of what's in the rule, what is interpreted as required, and what is realistic in terms of actually keeping track of things. I was speaking with someone earlier today, and we were talking about payroll companies and what payroll companies are doing. I would start to tee this up with them. I'm assuming, most of them know that this is an issue, but find out what they're doing, start to have those dialogues now in terms of how they can help you keep track of hours worked and keep track of this accruing benefit, especially for employees who have inconsistent schedules. A quick note about the exempt employees, the salaried exempt employees. If you have someone who is part-time salaried, they work either by rule or matter of course less than 40 hours, you should be keeping track of those people's hours. You don't necessarily have to pay them overtime, but I would highly recommend that you continue to keep those hours tracked, because that 40 hour for a full-time salaried employee isn't necessarily going to be imposed on those folks. Notices and posters. So under the PMLA, I'm sure we all knew we had a poster requirement, put it in the break room, put it right next to all your other posters that you can get from either the DOL or the state of Michigan. ESTA also has a poster requirement. Those posters are currently available in English and Spanish. If you have a workforce where 10% or more speaks another language, we would recommend getting a poster in that language as well. And there's also this new requirement that you have to provide written notice at the time of hire of their ESTA rights. Enforcement, and litigation, which is everyone's, I think, big fear and concern in all of this. Under the PMLA, there was no private cause of action for non-compliance. So what that means is if you were an employer who, let's say, was not providing someone with the full 40 hours that they had earned under the PMLA, that was something that would get enforced through the state regulatory agency. You could file a complaint with them if you were an employee, but it would be up to the state to enforce. And that had to be filed within 6 months. Under ESTA, there is now a private cause of action for employees who don't get their ESTA time, or who think that they have been retaliated against for use of their ESTA time, or that there was some kind of interference with their ability to get their ESTA time. So it's going to look very similar to a claim under the FMLA. Those same kind of interference, retaliation, and access to benefits, questions that come up in litigation. So what do we do from here? Revisiting those wage and hour increases and issues that we talked about at the front end. I highly recommend conducting some kind of internal audit. Go back and look at your job descriptions, make sure that those are up to date and actually reflect the work that people are doing, especially if you have had any kind of reorganization or big changes in what those folks realistically do. I know especially in the last couple years, the way people work and the things we ask them to do have changed a lot as a result of COVID and new trends in remote work and things like that. So this would be a good opportunity to go back and just make sure all of those job descriptions are up to date, and that your salary thresholds are being met in order to maintain those exemptions, and make sure you start budgeting now if you haven't already for those changes. ESTA, good news, there's a lot of time to comply. The flip side of that is there's a great chance that this presentation parts of it will no longer be in effect by February 21st. There's a good chance that there's going to be changes, be it through lame duck or new guidance from Leo, something like that. So please, please, please stay tuned on this. Keep up to date. Leo has a great FAQ section And they're pretty good about fielding questions too. A lot of these organizations have compliance hotlines and things like that. Think about when your benefit years are and how the interplay of maybe your benefit year starts January 1, but these changes are going to go into effect in February. What are you going to do with any kind of accrual or rollover that is taking place in that kind of month and a half there? Whether you want to do one pot or two pots for your PTO and your ESTA time. Because of these rollovers, you might want to consider bifurcating those again. I know a lot of folks before the PMLA kept those separate, and then we moved to a more combined general PTO policy. Think about how you want to deal with that because of that constant accrual issue and the rollover issues. If you want to divide them up, because I don't think what anyone wants is year after year rollover of any kind of PTO, which is what could happen if you combine, and then make sure that your payout policies, if you do pay out, say, unused vacation, but you have this combined policy, think about how that could end up playing out in real life for you guys. Front loading, we touched on that in terms of some of the challenges there for maybe, full-time equivalents. That might make a lot of sense to front load. If you have a lot of part-time employees or high turnover workforces, you might want to reconsider that. And those posters are available now, so feel free to order them and get them up.
Thank you, Heather.
Yes, you're welcome.
Thank you so much. We're going to wrap up, but hopefully Hannah will agree to stay for a few more minutes. We do have the room for about another few minutes, so if you want to ask a question more directly, is that okay with you,
Oh,
Hannah?
absolutely, absolutely. I'll be here.
Perfect. So, again, a lot of change is afoot, and I can tell you from just monitoring the situation in Lansing with the legislature, there is a strong movement afoot, largely being led by the Michigan Chamber of Commerce, which we are an important partner with, to get some of these new regulations re-amended, since they began being amended, and that's what caused some of the problem. But it is very fluid, but you just don't want to be caught without a plan in place if and when these changes are implemented. Because again, especially the ESTA, it affects everybody in this room, and it's something that you are going to want to be mindful of, because the last thing you want is an employee to sue you for lack of benefits, and then be in a bigger mess. So Hannah, thank you so much, and to Clark Hill for the presentation. They regularly provide us with updates, and we of course will share that with our members when we get them. So before we leave, again, want to thank our presenting sponsor, Michigan United Credit Union, for your generous support of our Professional Edge series. And for those of you who might be attending your first chamber event or haven't been to one in a while, we always want somebody to leave with something they're going to come with, so we always have a drawing, a little handout. Today's little gift is from courtesy of Michigan United Credit Union. It says it's a $2,500 Visa gift card. Oh wait, I'm sorry, it's $25 gift card, but
It's $50.
oh, it's $50. Ah, see, I'm wrong again. So they've upped their game. Congratulations.
Don't worry, I took it out of your.
Must have been must have been a good year of the credit union. So Jim, I'm going to ask you to pull the lucky winner.
Brian Austin.
Brian Austin, the Boston Benefits Group, and Brian, I am available for lunch if you don't know. So
Thank you.
congratulations. Again, thank you all for coming. Hopefully we'll see you at Member Coffee on the 31st and at our last two events in December. Make it a great day.